Welcome, everyone, to today's edition of the Conversation on Food Justice series, a collaboration between Share Our Strength and Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. In a moment when we seem to be receiving an onslaught of tough news, I'm grateful that many of you are joining us today in community for a thoughtful and nuanced conversation. I want to thank my partner, Julie McNulty, Corby Kummer, and Mary Castillo from Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, and all of my wonderful colleagues at Share Our Strength. At Share Our Strength, we are committed to ensuring that all kids have access to 3 healthy meals a day, 365 days a year. But we know that there are unnecessary barriers that influence or sometimes make it hard to do that. We are committed to breaking down those barriers and through conversations like today, elevating important issues and offering solutions. As a child, I did not have a lot of options about the food that I ate. But little did I know how the images, messages, and convenience of the options we had dramatically affected our choices. I'm so glad we will have the opportunity to have a balanced and informative discussion today about this. 2 quick notes. The last 20 minutes of this discussion, we will have Q&A. So please submit any questions that you have in the chat throughout the conversation. We are also thrilled to have again Spanish language translation provided by Community Language Collaborative. Please access audio options by clicking the interpretation icon found at the bottom of your screen. Also, immediately following this discussion, after a brief 5-minute intermission, I will lead a 30-minute informal fireside chat where we will reflect on what we just heard and try and answer any questions we didn't get to. I'll be joined in that conversation by Dr. Omni Cassidy and Katie Workman, Share Our Strength Leadership Council member. Please join us for that immediately following if your schedule accommodates. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce today's dream team of a panel. We'll put their full bios in chat. First, the incredible and dynamic Omni Cassidy, research psychologist and assistant professor of population health at New York University School of Medicine. Her research focuses on the intersection of race, culture, and the food environment. Welcome, Omni. Dr. Marcia Chatelain, scholar and professor of history of African American studies at Georgetown University. She is also the winner of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in History for her extraordinary book franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. And I believe the incredible second African American woman to receive that distinction. And our moderator, Dr. Christina Economos, professor of public health and community medicine at the Tufts University School of Medicine. Among many other incredible things, Christina has worked tirelessly to inspire behavior, policy, and environmental change to decrease obesity and improve the health of America's children. So inspired by all of your great work, and so appreciate you being with us today. Christina, I'll turn it over to you to start the discussion.
Great, thank you, Elliot. Welcome, everyone. Such an honor to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I'll be moderating a discussion, as you heard, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please be thinking about questions that you can submit. So I want to start by asking you both how you came to this work and what drives your continued commitment to the work. So maybe you could each take a couple of minutes and just talk personally about why you're working on these issues. And Marcia, I could start with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the warm welcome to this conversation. I think that for me, the conversation about food and, about choices and inequality really stems from my work as a historian, as much as it stems from the fact that I grew up in the 1980s. And I think that in the 1980s, there was a real shift in a kind of public consciousness about nutrition. Some of it was because of the work of Surgeon General C. Everett Koop. Some of it was because of a changing media landscape of advertising and concern around advertising to children. But I think a large part of it also were ways in which the public health community was able to communicate the disparities along racial lines in terms of longevity, health, and outcomes. And so in the middle of all of this, there were a series of conversations about the fast food industry that I grew up listening to the evolution of. And for me, as a historian, I think that every policy conversation needs to begin with a thorough interrogation of the history, the backstory. How did we get here? And so in my book, Franchise, I talk about how McDonald's, which is ostensibly a brand of white suburban mid-century America, how it became a fixture in so many Black and Brown communities. And it's about the intersection of attempts to use private sector businesses to respond to the unfinished business of racial injustice and the growth of the fast food industry, which has expertly enticed people with its marketing, with its community outreach, with its sensibilities. And so all of this is to say that in many ways, I think I grew up with the evolution of that discourse from the days of low-fat diets in the 1980s. I mean, people my age, we did not grow up eating eggs. We ate one egg a week, and we never ate white bread. And we were raised on a kind of common sense understanding about health. And now we're at a place where we're starting to understand that it's not just about food and what people consume, but the conditions and the context in which these choices are made.
Thank you so much. And it's so nice to have a historian who's really joining the conversation about food like this. And Omni, I'd love to hear from you now about what brought you here and what is driving your continued commitment.
Absolutely. First, thank you all so much for having me here. It's such an honor. Thank you, Elliot, for that wonderful introduction, Christina for moderating, and such an honor to be on this panel with you, Marcia. And your work is so prolific and amazing, and I'm a huge fan. So it's such a delight to be here. And for me, I grew up. I was born and raised in Mississippi, so a lot of my work and a lot of my passion has stemmed from what I saw around me growing up. When I was younger, almost everyone in my family, after they reached a certain age, was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, excessive weight, and categorized as obese or overweight. And it was very commonplace. And I very much grew up believing that this was just what it meant to be a grandmother or a grandfather. I watched my grandmother, take insulin shots. My grandfather would give her insulin shots every morning. And it was so common that, in many ways, I thought that was just, normal. And I had, fortunately, I had a mother who was very intentional about breaking those, what she called generational cycles around unhealthy eating and the negative health effects of those things. And it was really her that began to open my eyes to what was happening in my family when it came to food. And I started to really think very differently about food. But as being young, I was really very focused on the individual level behaviors. And obviously I knew that there were, components of my family and my culture, but that wasn't the main piece that was predominant. It was very much focused on individual eating behaviors. And so I was very health focused, health conscious because of how I grew up in my immediate family. But also very interested in these types of topics and these types of concepts as they related to the culture that I grew up in. And it really wasn't until I went to college and I started to be exposed to this whole world of research and public health and health disparities in a food environment. I didn't even know that there was such a thing that existed for people to think about and to research and to ask questions about. And as I was learning this in college, I started to think back to how it was when I grew up. Like, wait a minute, this is my neighborhood, this is my community, this is my family. So this isn't just my family. This is actually something that is systemic in many ways, and that is built into the cultures and built into the environment in ways that I really was unaware of. And it's through this knowledge that it really unveiled much of these issues that existed in the environment. And from there, it really just sort of snowballed. And I really like to share the personal story of the fact that I'm a huge Beyonce fan. And when she was sponsored by Pepsi back in 2012, I remember being, like truly upset and appalled and confused about why someone who I saw in a certain way as being very health conscious, like many young Black girls who look up to Beyonce, and I was really unaware that there were certain tactics that food and beverage companies would use to market their products to encourage young Black girls like me to purchase their products. And that was the first time when that happened, and Beyonce accepted that sponsorship, and the feeling that I got, and feeling like I was being manipulated intentionally by these marketers, was the first time that I then started to really utilize and apply a lot of the energy and the knowledge and the commitments that I had started to make towards the area of food and beverage marketing. And now what continues to fuel and drive me is this desire to share and unveil this to as many people in my community as I can, so that they can begin a very similar journey within themselves, so that they not only recognize, what may be happening in the environment around them, but then feel empowered enough to do something about it, whether that's to become a researcher, to go into the area of food policy, food marketing, or if it's just becoming an advocate within their own environments and their own communities, to ensure that the environments that they live in, the environments that they're in with their families and their communities, are environments that are actually designed to improve and support their health and wellness, as opposed to breaking it down.
Thank you both so much for sharing your story, especially for people who are listening, who are still building their careers, thinking many of us start with a personal experience early in life, and it really builds to scholarship and writing and studying and practice that can impact an entire nation. So really just so grateful to both of you for the challenge that you've taken on with the work that you're doing and the impact you're having. So I want to get a little specific now, and Omni, maybe I could start with you, and maybe drawing from some of the data that you've collected and some of your scholarship and that of others around foods marketed differently in communities of color. What does that look like, and what is the impact?
Absolutely. So the short answer is yes, that food and beverage companies absolutely disproportionately market unhealthy products to communities of color. And most of the work out there in our field has been on young people. That's the data that's most readily available, because as you can imagine, some of this data is really hard to get your hands on, especially when we're talking about most of the work in the past has been in looking at TV broadcasting, and in order, a lot of that data is proprietary, and so you have to find very creative ways in order to actually gather the data. But what we do know when it comes to youth, young children all the way up to about 17, 18 years old, primarily African-American, Black communities, and also Hispanic communities, tend to see disproportionately more unhealthy food and beverage products, meaning that if a company is selling chips and they also happen to have a healthier version of, let's say, water, they're more likely to market those chips to communities of color than the water, even though they have both of those items in their inventory. And we also see that in areas that are predominantly Black and Brown, those are areas where there are more likely to be unhealthy products placements, whether that's on billboards, on TVs, in bus stations. There tend to be more unhealthy products than healthy products represented in those communities. The other thing that we see is that the people who are represented in these food and beverage ads, more likely, if it's an unhealthy product, it's going to be a Black and a brown person as opposed to a person who is of another race, usually a white person. And so these are some of the main areas where food and beverage companies really do disproportionately tailor a lot of their messages around unhealthy product promotion to our communities. And the impact is really significant. And it's both significant and also hidden at the same time. There's a big nuance there, because we're talking about a component in the entire food environment. And food and beverage marketing is one piece of this unhealthy food environment that disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. And so it can be very challenging to identify the direct impact of food and beverage marketing as it sits within this larger context. But we do know that the evidence is showing us, particularly in children and youth, that exposure to these disproportionately unhealthy food and beverage ads increases the risk of unhealthy eating, poor diet, which essentially leads to excessive weight gain and eventually these unhealthy health effects over time. So this is certainly challenging and problematic in our communities, and it's something that we try to do a lot of work in trying to understand and gather the data to really support these perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. And we know from national data that we're spending more than half of our food dollars away from home. So the point you just made about, specifically exposure at point of purchase and when you're eating out really matters, when half of our calories and our money spent, and sometimes even more than half of our calories, are coming from away from home. Thank you. So Marcia, I want to turn to your book, Franchise, and the duality that you describe in the book, how McDonald's in particular made significant investments in Black communities that were really positive, and at the same time, there were consequences, and some unintended and some really expected. And maybe just unpack that for us a little bit more.
Yeah, so in my book, I really examine this question of what happens in the United States in 1968 that allows for the entry of fast food brands into predominantly Black communities. And the link is the fact that after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, there are calls for Black capitalism to be the salve for what ails people. And essentially that means the opening of Black businesses and more Black entrepreneurship in highly segregated areas. And the fast food industry, through the franchise model, makes that possible, not only in the granting of opportunities for Black franchise owners, but also the fact that for McDonald's particularly, and then Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken and the other brands that follow suit, they're really well capitalized. So they are able to sustain any risks that come with opening in certain communities. And what they find is that there's a Black consumer market that is hungering for the attention of the marketplace, as well as cities that are in a position where there are fewer places in which people can get food. There is a departure of grocery stores from many inner city communities. Many of them don't return until very recently. The mom and pop kind of restaurant is no longer able to stay in business during the 1970s. And so in its place is McDonald's. And what my book really looks at is just the constrained choices that are available to African Americans in business, as well as African American community leaders who have to make the really difficult decision as to whether they're going to endorse fast food as a solution to problems, or they're going to interrogate fast food's ability to do the many things that it promises to do. And it's not only bringing Black consumers into a certain marketplace, but it's providing jobs, and it's also creating a mechanism for a kind of philanthropic outreach before we call it corporate social responsibility. And so in these tensions about what to do with fast food, I think what I highlight is that these private sector solutions to any type of injustice, particularly food injustice, will never quite yield the results that we desire.
Thank you. It's a really complicated story, and you've, I think, elegantly helped us understand this duality and how it's, present in many ways in our country, and people really do need to understand it. So I want to switch and talk a little bit about stigma. And, you know, we have a lot of advertising that goes on toward unhealthy foods, and yet people are stigmatized when they consume those foods. And as you described, it happens more in communities of color where the advertising is more prevalent. And there's a lot of shame and blame and stigma that goes along with that. So I wonder how we can change that conversation. How are you both really processing this, I would say, conversation going on around stigma, and what can we do as researchers and what can the public do to really change the narrative there? And it's really to both of you, so feel free to jump in.
Thank you. It's such an excellent question, and it's certainly very, very complex. And what I'm finding has been most helpful in the work that I have done, not just now, but even starting in grad school, is to really talk to the people in the communities that are, you know, it's one thing for me as a public health, you know, expert researcher to talk about these things, and I spend a lot of time reading and writing and thinking about these things at this level. But I find the richest conversations come when we actually get to talk to teenagers and parents about what it means to live in these environments where there is this mixedness, there is these you know, this you know, it appears as if there's this promotion of healthy food and be healthy and eat healthy, and if you don't eat healthy, then you are doing something wrong. Well, at the same time, there is still a whole lot of support from policymakers, from the public, even for these companies to have such a huge hold and such a huge influence on the way that we think about food. And having conversations with them, you hear the challenges, you hear the frustrations, you hear that the true efforts that many families go through to purchase healthy foods for their families, to make choices, the disappointment that they have in society, in public health institutions, who they trust to be able to share information about these things, but have fallen short time and time again, because, you know, in many ways, there is this complex relationship between, you know, public health institutions and government and policy and food and beverage companies. And so having these conversations with them is really the best place to really try to understand, you know, where the nuances are, and then how to best support people in very tailored ways. So a lot of my work in grad school was in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland area, and some of their, and also in rural areas right outside of that. And so some of their questions, some of their the potential solutions really stemmed around giving them greater access to healthier foods and encouraging them to grow their own food. There was much more an agricultural bend to some of the solutions around these things. But that will be very different for communities in urban areas potentially. And that's just one example. And so I think for me and for a lot of the work that I do, we're working with communities and talking to communities about how we can best serve them, how we can best really stand in the gap for them, and not really try to be on one side or the other, but really come alongside of them and stand in that gap and help support them and giving them the power that they need, the resources that they need to make these solutions that can really be in the best interest for them and their families.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. I do community-based participatory research, and, you know, learning from people in community and with lived experience in a variety of ways is the best part of the work that I do, and helps really craft solutions alongside the evidence that are meaningful and, as you said, context specific. It's really important to understand where people are, and it's also a big country, and it's different when you move around the country and understand the different contextual factors that impact people. So thank you for that. Marcia?
You know, I'm really glad that you brought up this issue of stigma, because a large part of the inspiration for writing Franchise was when I was a PhD student, learning more about food justice movements and you know, reading classics like A Diet for a New America, and thinking about how people were addressing these issues on the local level, something that made me deeply uncomfortable, was the ways that there was a real, what's the word I'm looking for? The characterization of the choice of eating fast food or allowing one's child to eat fast food as it related to these larger issues. And so, I would be in groups of people who were fighting really, diligently about food access, but then disparaging people for allowing, fast food to be in their household, or, suggesting that it was just pure ignorance or maybe even pure negligence on their part, and not understanding that the way that the fast food industry wins people over, it's not just the food. The food's not that great, but it is the place and community that becomes significant. And I think that what has happened over the past decade, particularly as there's more diversity in the food justice movement, different programs and different models are getting attention, people are realizing that judging individual food choices doesn't get us anywhere. But I think what my contribution is to suggest that the affective nature of the fast food industry's marketing, particularly to African Americans, makes it really hard to say that it's a bad presence. If McDonald's is underwriting scholarships to historically Black colleges and universities, if they are paying for the back to school parade, if Black franchise owners are in many ways operating like the unelected officials of the corners of Black America that people are really struggling in, if they are providing the only jobs, if they are giving the second chance for a person who has a felony conviction record to work somewhere, then I don't have a very strong case when I say, well, you probably shouldn't eat at McDonald's. And so I think that the recognition of the context in which people are making food choices helps reduce the deep desire to use stigma as a motivator, or to reduce people into a series of bad choices. And it also, I think, makes the work more difficult, because it isn't just an analysis of calories and nutrition, but it requires a critique of capitalism. It requires some really, really tough questions about the distribution of public resources and how we really support people to be their strongest. And the second thing that I just want to note also, in a lot of these conversations, sometimes people say, before fast food, there was this kind of golden era of Black eating, but I really, really want to disrupt that notion, because of racism, African Americans have always struggled to get a consistent and quality source of food, whether it's because people were living under the sharecropping system where they would just eat whatever leftovers they could get from the harvest, whether it was the fact that urban Americans, even before the advent of fast food in their communities, were struggling against the quality of food in grocery stores. There has always been a real racial gap in terms of access to quality, well-rounded diets. And so while I think that fast food has played an important role, it is not just the fast food industry that is on the hook for these problems.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Sort of rethinking the mental models for all of us and for society is really important around stigma and judgment and blame and all of these things. So please.
Marsha, that was beautiful comments,
Yeah.
and it also just got me thinking about how powerful it has been in having conversations with community members, like mainly teenagers, when you start to share that there is this larger context at play, that it's not just their own choices, that it's not just about how they eat or how they don't eat, and good and bad and healthy and unhealthy. And although we talk about that from a health perspective, but whenever we have conversations with them and we really illuminate this larger environment that they're in, that's not even just about food, but as Marsha, about capitalism. It's about the institute, and it's literally embedded in almost everything that they do, that has this really powerful influence on them, and it's been having a really powerful influence on them for a really long time. You can just sense the relief. It's like there's something in them that knew that, like, it wasn't just their fault, but because you get these messages. They've gotten these messages for so long that it is their fault, and therefore the entire responsibility rests on them. And to kind of bring it out, to allow them to step back and encourage them to step back and be alongside of them as they step back and be able to survey all of this. It really does provide a lot of relief, and then a renewed sense of empowerment to make different choices. That it's not just about them, that it's really about this larger context. So I just wanted to add that point.
No, thank you. Thank you. So we're in about 5 or 6 minutes, we'll move into the audience Q&A, but wanted to ask you both about social media influence, and just interested in your comments on this. It's very strong, particularly for young people. And you already mentioned a campaign, for sugar sweetened beverage that I know had a social media component. They all do. How do you think we could really leverage social media platforms for good? Is there hope there? Is it just gone too far? Or is there a way that, as a community of scholars working alongside, communities, that we can try to create some good here? Do you have thoughts about it? Marcia.
Well, I think two things that are really kind of interesting about this changing landscape. The period of time that I look at in my book, in the 1970s, it was all about the introduction of Black representation in print advertisements and commercials, and McDonald's was really the leader in that kind of strategy. And today what's interesting is that the big fast food companies, they go to Twitter and they go to TikTok, they go to these kind of low cost of entry spaces in which they use a lot of Black popular culture to sell their products, and they do it really effectively. The one thing that I will say is that although there are still dynamics of power and access on social media platforms, this is probably the greatest kind of, this is a more equalized space in which interests that want to really help people think about not only their food choices, but food inequality can also enter that space. I have been really, really surprised by the ways that food influencers have been able to really kind of generate a following by speaking to what people desire rather than what people can't have. I think of someone like Tabitha Brown as a Black vegan. I mean, her popularity on social platforms is really fascinating, because a lot of what she's doing with food is to say, this is a meat alternative, but this is also a flavorful experience. This is also very fun. And she's, become very popular and has been able to leverage her brand with all sorts of kind of marketing collaborations. But I think that space provides multiple points of entry to ask people to think about food choices from different angles. In an earlier period of time, when television, radio, and print advertising were the only spaces in which the public health community could enter, because of the cost of that would be, virtually impossible. You would have to, rely on the ad council for something national, or, God, I'm such a product of the 80s. I remember the Surgeon General would have commercials about smoking, those things, but those things are very high cost, and they require a level of production sophistication that is not available to a lot of people in this space. And so, I see it as a place of a lot of potential and a lot of possibility.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Omni, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, two things, more about the problem, and then, to answer the question about our movement forward. Social media marketing, food and beverage companies are becoming more and more and more and more sophisticated. And in fact, a lot of my work is starting to even move into this immersive digital marketing just as a whole, because marketers are becoming, big food is becoming big data companies where they are collecting enormous amounts of data. I mean, millions of points of data on individual people, to be able to tailor ads specifically to them based on their preferences, based on their patterns, based on their perceived affect of posts. their friend circle. It's becoming more and more and more sophisticated, and it's also becoming more and more embedded in the ways that we engage in digital environments. And so certainly it is something that food and beverage companies are really have hopped on in such a incredible, and I'll say that word in like the truest sense, like truly incredible. And they often get rewarded for that within the marketing industry. So it's a very challenging wheel to stop turning. And so the efforts, though, as Marcia pointed out, like the opportunities, as much opportunities as food and beverage companies have, although we don't have as much money as they have to be able to have as many opportunities within the public health space. There are a lot of efforts, and I think that where we have the power is in the people. People bring power, and money is not the only place where power exists when it comes to this marketing. And I'm actually part of an initiative that's led by the Council on Black Health, which is founded originally by Shariki Kimanika, which many people may know, and also in leadership by this leadership organization called Heart Smiles MD that is based out of Baltimore. They work a lot with young people on leadership and personal development. And as part of this initiative, we have put together this essentially social media campaign where we're wanting to identify young people who have a following, who have an influence on social media, to really essentially like take back the food narrative from food and beverage companies, and instead identify how food needs to work for us and our bodies and be so satisfying, and that the marketing around it has really hijacked our ability to eat in ways that are healthy and that can really promote our wellness. And so it's called Operation Good Food and Beverage. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but that's one of the ways that we are working with young people on social media. So this is a social media only campaign where we're really, utilizing the same kind of efforts that many of them have within the social media space to really promote new messages and really take back the messages around food and beverages.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to move we have a bunch of audience questions. I'm going to move to some of them now, but I really want to note the hopefulness that I hear in your voices, which is awesome. And maybe at the end, if we have time, you can just talk a little bit about what else is giving you hope right now. Because I think, although we're talking about a lot of problems, I think there's a lot of great things happening too. And with the two of you leading in many different ways, I think we're going to see more change. So I want to ask a question from the audience, noting that there are many school nutrition directors and district diversity directors in the audience. And we have programs in this country, as you all know, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, school meals, and these programs really can reduce stigma and increase food access. But even though these programs are available, they're still not working, as this person noted, with respect to implementation as well as they could be. So the question to both of you is, what policy changes can we make to increase healthy food access and reduce reliance on unhealthy foods, specifically around some of these large federal programs that are really designed to provide assistance and sometimes prescribed for healthy foods? So in the area of policy.
I can jump in here and speak just a little bit about it, although most of my policy work has not been on the larger federal programs. Some of my colleagues have worked very closely, and what most of us have found, and speaking with colleagues, is there are a huge amount of restrictions around the types of foods that the federal programs will allow individuals and families to purchase, which I know is not the only point that limits access, but certainly is a really huge one. And on a personal anecdote, I see those notes myself when I go to the grocery store on what cannot be purchased, and there's quite a bit on there that is related to. There's so many healthy non-packaged foods that tend to be a part of those lists. And I know that there has been over time quite a bit of efforts to remove those types of restrictions. I still think that they're there, and being able to like allowing people to utilize all of those federal programs in order to purchase as like all types of foods and any foods that they will need, particularly those foods that are health promoting, can go a long way in increasing access, particularly to food to healthy foods. And I know there has been a lot of work in certain areas in certain states, at least, on allowing these benefits to be used at farmers markets and things like that. And there has been varying levels of success, because I think, at least my knowledge is that many of these programs have been pilot programs, and the funding has not always continued, so that there can be consistent access to these types of foods. But I think that there is just a huge amount of restrictions around the types of foods that individuals can purchase, which I think is incredibly problematic when you're wanting people to be able to purchase healthy foods within these federal programs.
Yeah, definitely, especially when it comes to, prepared foods. I think, like, an example people use a lot is a rotisserie chicken, where it's saving an incredible amount of time, and it's just, healthy protein for a family that can be, served the second you get it home, basically. So I think there is a lot of movement in terms of meal kits and prepared foods, and time stress is a big issue for families, and making sure that it's available and able to be served immediately is a really big problem. Did you want to comment on that, Marcia? No. Okay, great. So why don't we move on? This question, maybe you could answer first. What can the food and beverage industry and the people working within that industry do to help influence access to good, healthy food?
Oh, well, I mean, I think, part of it is that for the large food companies, they do have some capacity for discounting through the use of coupons, through the use of, giveaways. They have the capital to make things available at a reduced or free cost in different contexts, without severely, hurting the bottom line. I mean, I think a lot of these issues are also about capacity for contracting. I think a lot of, to go to the earlier question about, food programs, in some places where it is small enough to contract with the local food purveyors for, healthy food, healthy lunches in the school lunch system, that's great, but it's a scale and size problem. And so I think that this is where, our food purveyors that are able to distribute, cheap, shelf-stable food isn't always the best food for us. And so I think that there will always be a real tension in terms of, what the industry is able to provide and what people genuinely need. And I think that this is one of the kind of tough consequences of living in an environment where we have incredible food diversity in the United States, but we don't always have inequality in terms of individuals' ability to make every choice available.
Yeah. Okay, this next question, we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to read it directly. Black Americans are currently leading the plant-based food movement. Do you see this as a growing trend, and how might organizations or companies support the growth of the Black plant-based food movement to support food access, nutrition, and sustainable solutions?
The thing that I'll say about this, or any kind of movement, I'm glad that you made the note about time stress. This movement is only as valuable as the capacity for people to do any of the things necessary in order to prepare and enjoy, food. And so, I don't have very strong feelings in terms of whether, soda should be banned, or if fast food should be kind of, taken away off the universe. I don't know if I will ever see that, but what I do know is that food advocacy has to really think about quality of life issues. And if people can't get quality healthcare, if we don't have an 8-hour workday that pays a living wage, if we don't have childcare, if we don't have any of these things, then every refrigerator filled with fresh food will make no difference. If we don't have the ability for people to pay their electric bills to keep food fresh, or their heating bills to be able to heat and prepare their foods. These initiatives have to also put a lot of pressure on localities and the federal government to make sure that working people have access to all of the things that you need necessary to have a sustainable and well-rounded diet. And so, you know, in the kind of column of what we can do, I think there has to be a dedicated portion of the food movement that is looking at wages, quality of work, childcare, the cost of utilities. Like, we are headed into an economic calamity. I mean, this upside down economy that we've been living in the past few years is going to hit its breaking point, because we have the lingering questions of long COVID. We have the cost of energy skyrocketing. We have inflation, and we have some real questions about local level programs that help people do the things necessary in order for them to work and provide for their families. And so I think that this needs to be part of the pivot of, you know, the questions about food and nutrition is what kind of structures are we supporting to allow people to do the things with food that we want them to do?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Omni?
and it's such a great question. And also, you know, it's a very hopeful, you know, it's one of the pieces that makes this kind of area and in this work, there's a lot of hope and a lot of energy surrounding the movement and the initiatives. And I, you know, echo Marsha that, you know, we have to think critically about it as a whole, because these things are time consuming, and, you know, it really will require a really significant shift in the way that we live our lives. And I do think that there is a sense that people are ready for that shift, especially like young people are in some ways fed up with the systems, all of them, like health system, the economic system, the food system. And I think a lot of it, there was, you know, justice system, right? And during this period of the COVID pandemic, I think that a lot of that came to a head in a very unique way, that that there is a sense that people are fed up and are wanting something different, and are now willing, or at least, you know, open to taking responsibility and doing it themselves. And when I say themselves, like them, their families and their communities, their friends, you know, their networks. And so I do think that there seems to be an increased energy around that, which I, you know, personally really like, and I can understand it. And I think that at the heart of it, there just seems to be this disenchantment. Not that there was really a whole lot within many Black and brown communities, but there is even more of a disenchantment and a desire to sort of like shift and do something for ourselves. And I do think that in many ways it could certainly support, you know, efforts, at least at the local level, to make some really significant changes.
Yeah, great. I love that a lot of this conversation has really been around systems changes and infrastructure, and that people really understand these things are hard to change and they are going to require more and more years. But the more momentum and the more that people understand that, the more likely we are through our voting, through our voices, through our actions to really make that kind of change. So that's awesome. So I did want to, oh, please. Yeah.
Sorry. And you just said that, and it made me think that I do think that people are starting to recognize that food is also, you know, an act, a radical act, you know, choosing what we eat in the midst of the environment that we're in. It is a radical act, and it is part of, you know, like sovereignty. And I think that is something that people are really trying to align with in a unique way.
Totally. So before I turn it back over to Mary to do the closing, I did want to come back to the hope part, because I think you both just have so much experience and knowledge and passion about this. What is making you hopeful? I know you touched on it a little bit, but if you could provide that in your closing comments, and certainly anything else that you didn't have a chance to say and I didn't ask you about, what do you want the audience to hear? So maybe if you could each take maybe 2 minutes to do that. And Marsha, I'll call on you first.
You know, I have been privy to a lot of conversations, particularly since 2014 with the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri. But most recently, with this book and with people asking different questions than they did before. When my book came out in January 2020, I think people thought of it as this kind of novel look at fast food and civil rights. And after the George Floyd summer, I think people appreciated the conversation because it was about how we start to look for different answers to enduring problems. And so we are at a moment right now where everything is on the table, where we have, wage workers at places like Amazon, at Starbucks, who have been told, oh, we don't have unions here. And they say, well, we do now. We have communities that were ravaged by COVID and came back and said, we're going to try mutual aid. We're not going to see who wants to rescue us, or if we're interesting, we're going to see what we have within ourselves. And so I think that there's a strange moment, because I think recent events, over the past 6 or 7 years have been feeling, for a lot of people have felt very diminished. And at the same time, they're recognizing their power in ways that are unimaginable. And so I think that we are in this really delicate moment where there is a real recognition of our vulnerability, and there's a new appreciation for our strengths. And so people are coming into a consciousness about food and nutrition, not because they want to look a certain way or because they want to signal something about their wealth or their power, but they're starting to really understand that this is one of a few, this is one vehicle for not only taking care of the self, but taking care of the community. And there's something really powerful in that. And I think that will continue to grow despite the challenges that we still have ahead of us.
Yeah, I love the way you just framed the shift in narrative. I agree with you. And looking back to sort of the low fat and, sort of about aesthetic and what people seem to be obsessed with versus just now, the oneness that we all want to have together and taking care of each other and the planet. And, as you both have eloquently described, the Black community really coming forward and speaking their voices and their truth and calling for change in a really different way, supported by, everyone else in the country. So it's beautiful. And thank you so much for describing your hope in that way. Omni, would love to hear from you too.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Marcia, your comments and also your comments, Christine, as well, that my hope is really in the people, particularly the young people, which I, work mostly with and I enjoy working with, and the enormous amount of creativity and drive for solutions, and for new opportunities that, possibly either weren't available for before, or they were told were not available, and then are really taking back, ownership of themselves and their lives, in a new way. And that to me, like, brings me so much joy and gives me so much life, and allows me to just sort of see that, this is, even though we are in a very challenging time, there is a huge amount of energy and efforts towards, it being better. And even if that means that, I'm going to be making it better for myself, for my family, for my community. And that's how it works. That is incredibly powerful. And we're no longer looking for this top-down approach, that we really are starting to feel the power of these, ground up type of moves and these ground up type of shifts and changes, and not only trusting in the initial energy and the effort, but then also wanting to plug in sustainability, to plug in that, we want this to continue for generations, not just for us now during this period, but we want to be building something that's also going to continue for our children and our children's children and our children's children. And so there's a true, empowerment. I try not to use that word very often, but there is like a renewed sense of internal power about the ability to be able to do this, that is independent of what a system has told them that they can or cannot do. And I love it so much, and I really get quite a bit of energy from it.
Thank you so much. Well, it's time to end. I feel like we could stay all day. I've learned so much just from the conversation, empowered, inspired, like so many things. Thank you both so much, Marcia and Omni, for making the time to talk to everyone who tuned in today. It was a really special conversation, and I'm so appreciative. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Casillo, who is going to give the closing remarks. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Economos, and thank you to our panelists, Dr. Marcia Chatlin and Dr. Omni Cassidy, for such an important conversation today. Much appreciation to our interpreter, Vidya Sosa of Community Language Cooperative, and thank you to my colleagues and friends at Share Our Strength, who with us at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute produced conversations on food justice. I'm Mary Castillo, Senior Program Manager at Food and Society, thanking all of you 300 plus who joined us today. If you're staying for our fireside chat, just stay on the Zoom during our 5-minute intermission, and then we'll be right back with Elliot Gaskins from Share Our Strength, Dr. Cassidy, and Katie Workman, philanthropist, chef, author, and Share Our Strength Leadership Council member. We'll be taking a short hiatus this summer, but don't worry, Conversations on Food Justice will be back in September when we will be talking about nutrition insecurity on college campuses. Join our email list and follow us on social media when we announce the date and panelists. And this session was recorded, so all of you will receive an email with the video link and a summary to action report. Thank you, and we'll keep the conversation going right after this intermission.